Hello and welcome to the session. This is Unit 5 of Week 1 and the topic we want to cover today is data integration and connectivity. So this is an important topic for planning because typically a planning solution is integrated into the overall IT system landscape. And since SAP Analytics Cloud is a pure cloud-based solution, we need to think about the different source systems which feed the data into the planning process. So typically master data is coming from a central system, so either a data warehouse or an ERP system, or from any other central database where you maintain the master data. But also typically in planning, you need some transactional data as a baseline for your plans, and this data is typically then also coming from another system, so from a transactional database or from any other IT system in your landscape. Depending on the system type, so there are different ways to set it up. So on the one hand side, you might integrate also with other cloud systems. Think about an S/4HANA cloud system or a SuccessFactors system, which is also running in the cloud. And in this case, of course, the integration is a lot of easier because here we're talking about a cloud-to-cloud integration. If the system is sitting behind the firewall, so it's an on-premise system in the customer's local network, then of course the system setup gets a little bit more complicated. In this case, we actually need to bridge between the public internet and the local corporate network, which we do with a component called the Cloud Connector. So this component has the functionality to bridge between the two network segments and to allow Analytics Cloud to import data from the source system running behind the corporate firewall. Then it depends also a little bit on the system protocol which is used to extract the data. So some systems use proprietary protocols, others use HTTP-based protocols. And then depending on these technologies, you might also need to install here a so-called cloud agent, which is an additional component which needs to be deployed inside the customer network. What is also important to understand is that in planning, we always rely on acquired data. So from BI, you might know that there's also a so-called live connectivity, which allows to consume the data directly from the source system without any data replication. In planning, we actually rely on the acquisition of the source system data. So meaning we need to import the data into our Analytics Cloud data model. The data management is actually then done inside the modeling environment. So there's a dedicated tab called data management. And in this data management, you can set up different import jobs. So for example, for both master data as well as transactional data. You can also connect several systems. So let's say if you're in a sales planning scenario and you have local customer databases in the different regions, you can then also connect to several systems in order to populate your customer dimension. The different master data jobs can also be set into relation. So for example, if you have several jobs to populate a dimension, so let's say there is an API to fetch the master data and then there's another API to fetch the hierarchy information. Then of course you want to cancel the whole sequence if one of these import job fails. And these kind of dependencies you can actually also set up when you define the import jobs. What you can also do is that you schedule the import jobs on a regular cadence. So let's say if you have a frequent master data updates, which you want to consider in your planning tool, so then you can also schedule here the import jobs to run on, let's say, every day or every week. So this is also possible here in the data management view. Before the data is actually stored inside the tables of the database for the SAC models, you can actually define so-called data wrangling. So this means that you can define transformations and define how the source data is actually transformed because it goes into the data model. So what we see here on the screenshot is a data wrangling environment for a particular import job. On the left-hand side, you see the fields which are exposed from the source system. And then in the middle screen for these tiles, we see actually then the structure of our SAC planning model. And of course, you need to map the fields of the source system API here to the different dimensions of your data model. You can then define also additional import settings, and you can also define data transformations. So let's say if you want to have a particular search and replace algorithm so that you want to map certain IDs to other IDs, so then you can define these in these transformation rules. And the transformation rules are also stored as part of the import job and are rerun whenever you import new data from the source system into your SAP Analytics Cloud data model. What is specific for planning is that you can also export data. So this is typically not the case in a BI or analytics scenario where you just import data from a source system and then you create your stories or your analytical application. But since in planning you typically generate new data or you change existing data, sometimes the data is also needed in other systems for, let's say, subsequent processes or for any other business process. And this is why in planning, there is also often the requirement that you are able to retract the plan data back into the source system. And this is also what is possible via the data management environment. So there is a section for the export where you can actually then push the data back into the source system, for example, into an S4 system. And the process here looks very similar to the import side. So there's also a so-called wrangling or mapping step where you define the source or the mapping between the source structure. So in this case, then the data model inside SAP Analytics Cloud to the structure in this remote system. So let's say a particular table in the S4HANA system. So you can also apply certain filter settings so that you just copy back your budget information, for example, and not the whole data which is sitting in the SAP Analytics Cloud data model. And as a next step, I want to also show you this in a real system, not just with theoretical slides. So now I'm back in the data modeling environment where we left end of last unit. And at this point in time, we have here the structure defined. So we have a data model with different dimensions. We have also loaded master data just via copy and paste from a workbook. And now as a next step, I want to populate this data model with transactional data. For this, I navigate to the data management view. And in the data management view, we can actually then create import jobs here for the transactional data. You see here the section below where we can also then export data later on, but for now we just want to import the transactional data. When I click on this button, I see two options. I can either upload here from a file or I can connect to a system. So this is here the item data source and load from an external system. So for example, from a data warehouse system or from an ERP system. Here in this first example, for our sales planning model, I've prepared here a local file and I'm going to upload the data here from this local file. I navigate to select source file and then I pick here my prepared Excel workbook. Since this workbook can have several tabs, I choose the one which contains the transactional data and then I hit the import button. What is happening now is that the system is actually uploading the data into a special region of the system. So here into the draft sources. And from the draft sources, I can then create my transformation rules and the mapping between the columns of this workbook and the dimensions of my data model. Once this is uploaded, I can open up now the data wrangling environment. And in the data wrangling environment, we can define the mapping between the source file and the dimensions of our data model. So initially, the system tries to map the fields or the columns here of our source file to the individual dimensions of our data model. So normally, if the naming convention is similar, so then this should also be successful. If this is not the case, you can actually undo the mapping and establish this manually. So for example, let's assume this product dimension was now mapped in the wrong way. So then I can just hit here on this icon and then see the mapping is released, and I can now just drag and drop the product here from the left-hand side into this middle screen. For the import, there are different global settings. So for example, you can specify how the data is treated, whether the existing data should be updated or whether you want to clean and replace existing data with the import data. So these are all kind of different settings you can specify. What we need to do here is that we need to map the versions. So I click here on the version dimension. Since we just have actual data here in our local file, I just need to map this version, but in general, there could be, of course, several versions in my source file. And then we can also have a preview. So I can switch here the layout between this card view and the grid layout. So here we see then a preview of the data to be imported. So we see how the Excel file was structured. So basically for each measure, we have here the data record for the different dimensions. And then finally, we have the numerical value then for gross sales in this example. Once this is done, I can click the finish mapping, but in case I want to do some transformations, so for example, I want to remap certain product IDs, I can specify here a transformation. So for example, I want to have here a replacement of particular product IDs, so I could specify here then this transformation rule. But in our case, I leave it basically as is and then finalize the mapping. And now the system actually moves data from the file into the underlying database table of our data model. I get here final confirmation, and then the data is loaded. So I get then a summary. So in this case, we imported 224,000 rows into our data model. And I also get then here the summary of this import job. This was here an ad hoc import. Normally, if we import data, let's say from a central IT system, so from an ERP system, of course, you want to schedule normally the import so that you rerun these import jobs on a regular basis. So now let's have a look into, let's say, a more realistic example. And in this scenario, I've created a financial planning model. So we see here that we have the account dimension called GL account. So this is representing then my GL accounts from the general ledger. We have a date dimension, then we have a cost center, functional area, profit center, trading partner, and we have a company code. And in this scenario, I want to actually load first master data from an S4 system, and then later on also the transactional data as a reference for my planning application. So in this case, I navigate then here to our organization and dimension, so to our company code dimension. You see initially this is all empty, so there is no master data loaded so far. And then I navigate here again to the data management view. And now I want to import my company code information from my central ERP system, an S4 system in this case. So again, I go here to the import icon and then I pick data source. And this time I pick here the S4HANA connector. Of course, someone or the administrator needs to create the connection first. So this was already done in a step before. And then the system is actually pulling the meta information from the S4HANA. So basically the catalog of existing OData services which are exposed. And then I need to pick the right one for the company code information. So we can have a look on the different APIs which are exposed. And here I already see the one for the company code, which I can select then. And since this API exposes also a lot of fields which I do not need here in my application, I can select the ones which I want to take over. So here in our case, I want to have the company code. So this is going then into the ID of my dimension members. I want to have the company name as the description. So then we had the country key as an additional attribute. So maybe for reporting purposes. And then of course, I want to have the currency information, describing the local currency of the particular company code. In principle, this is the same workflow as we have seen for the local file import. So now I'm getting here into this data wrangling environment. I see a preview of the uploaded or the extracted data. So now this information is coming from the S4 system. We see here the different IDs for the company code. We see then the name of the company, we see the country key, and we see then also the currency. So these are the fields we have actually picked. And now here on the right-hand side, I need to map those fields here to my dimension properties. So here the company code should go to my dimension ID. And then in the next step, the company name should go to the description. The currency and the country key have been mapped already. So and then I click on finish. And then the system is loading the data. And once this is done, I get here the success message. And in this case, of course, only 23 rows have been imported here into the dimension of our planning model. If I wanted to now set up a regular import, so I can set up here then basically a schedule. So you can see that I want to have here maybe a repeating frequency. You can then set up here the cadence. You can specify additional properties. And then I would have here a regular import job running then on the cadence I have specified. So, but I leave this for now. The workflow for transactional data is actually exactly the same. So let's have a look here again. So the workflow for importing the transactional data is actually quite similar. So now let's take a look. So for our company code is now properly imported. So we have 24 records, and now I want to import the transactional data. So here I need to be then in the model overview, not on a particular dimension. And then if I navigate here to data management, we can actually now set up an import job for the transactional data. So I navigate again here into the import menu, and then I pick data source, and again I go to the S/4HANA connector. I pick my connection, and then I will see the catalog of the available OData APIs. And this time I'm interested in the journal entries. So this is going to the universal journal of the S/4HANA system. And I pick here this particular OData service. And now the system is pulling all the fields from this OData service. And if you scroll down, we see that these are a lot. Probably most of the fields are not relevant here for my planning scenario. So I start here with the measures coming from the S4 system. So I want to have, of course, the amounts in company code currency. And then I need to find, of course, my company code. We have cost center. We have the fiscal year period. So this is the time dimension. We have the GL account. We have functional area. We need to specify the ledger. So this is going into the filter. And then I think we have the profit center and the trading partner. So the ledger I'm going to filter. So this is coming from the standard ledger, so 0L. And we can, of course, also specify the time dimensions. So here I need to go back to our fiscal year period and say this should be greater than, let's say, 001-2018. And less than 012-2018. So then I can hit the create button. And now the same workflow is executed. So first the data is loaded into this, let's say, staging area, into the draft sources. And then from there I can define my data wrangling. So I can map then here the fields which have not been automatically mapped. So this looks good now. The system was able to map all the fields of my OData service to the relevant dimensions of my data model. Here we can have the same import settings as we've seen in the flat file upload. And of course, we are importing here directly into the actual version. So I hit finish mapping, and now the transactional data is then loaded from the S/4HANA system into our SAC planning model. And once this is done, we get here the summary of the import job so that it was successful. And now we have populated our planning model with transactional data from an S/4HANA system. In a real scenario, of course, I can also set up here a regular cadence for this import job. And then on a constant basis, the data would be pulled from S4 and transferred here into my SAC planning model. If I want to export then later on the data, so let's say we have run our planning cycle, then actually the same workflow will apply. So I come here to the data management, and then I can also set up here an export job. You see that we support here exports to different system types. So you can export to BPC, you can export to SAP IBP and S4. And we have also now export capability back into BW. So this is behind this export to all data services. And with this, I want to finish this session. Thanks for attending and hope to see you next time.